Now we're going to start working on these back walls that we have. And I'm going to do so with the smaller square-headed brush for this back area because it does have those sharp edges which will help me cut around the tops and the bottoms. But before we do that, we're going to mix our paint. Now initially, I wanted to go into this with just a subtle gray for the background, which you are more than welcome to do. It's going to make all of your paints pop even more. But now, I really liked that pigment that we mixed previously, and I want it to be a combination between a gray and that. So, I'm going to take out my palette knife, and I'm going to start mixing something similar to that. So I'm going to take some primary red here, I'm going to take some burnt umber, mix these two together just as we did initially. It's very warm, it's very earthy. Now I'm going to grab a good amount of titanium white and just a hint of Mars Black to desaturate it. The Mars Black is much stronger than the titanium white, so we don't want to use a lot of it, but a little bit will work quite well. Now here we have a nice grayed, desaturated version of what we had over there. Work really nice for the stone. It'll have all of that pink reflecting down onto it. It'll be a little bit more earthy and natural. Going to dip the end of my brush in my water and start grabbing some of that pigment. Now we'll give it a try. So we can see it's quite pink on the palette, or rather on the painting, but it does have that nice burnt umber in it as well. There we are. Using the edge of the brush to cut in the tops, make them nice and sharp. Just like that. We'll have it come back here where I would assume this wraps around and into the back. Fades nice and subtly. Cleaning my brush off here. And if you want it to be a little bit more gray, we can take some white, take a little bit of black, mix that together. Continuously just grabbing very minute amounts of that Mars Black. We can try mixing that in there as well, see if we like it. Does make it a little bit more gray. It's not a bad thing. It's very subtle. Can make it a little bit brighter. Try that out. Remember, if you don't try, you fail. And acrylics are so easy to rework, you might as well try. Now I'm really liking this. We have the backing of that burnt umber, that primary red, and now we have this gray on top. But it isn't just a gray, it isn't flat. It does have a bit of color showing through it. And I think we found the perfect mixture here. There we go. Now, when I move to the foreground, this brush is really quite small. So I'm going to switch over to my medium-sized square-headed brush. Get the tip of it fairly wet. Going to grab this initially, apply it. As you can see here, we'll go over portions of our foliage, and it's really quite pink, saturated. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to switch to my palette knife. I'm going to mix a little bit more Mars Black titanium white into it. Seems it's about time I also add a little bit more Mars Black and titanium white to my palette. Remember, these do dry and are somewhat time sensitive. There we go. Get a little bit more red and brown while we're at it, just to ensure we are fully loaded across the board. So, grab a little bit more red, mix a good amount of pigment here. Some brown, titanium white, again, a little bit of Mars black. Now this is fairly dark and saturated compared to what we have right beside it. So we're going to grab a good amount of additional titanium white, throw that in there. There we are. Value-wise, it's much closer and it's a little bit more saturated, which I want because it is closer in the painting to us. And remember, as you get farther back into the background, things should get more desaturated. So this is a perfect step up from what we were using before. So I'm going to dip my brush, and I'll apply it right here so you can see it in contrast with our initial application. There we are. Subtle differences can do quite a lot. Using that square-headed brush because we're cutting along all of these edges very cleanly. Remember to grab additional water if the pigment stops spreading cleanly. You start to get more of that chalky aesthetic, more of that rough canvas tooth showing through. There we are. We can go back and clean up these top areas and lampposts when we get to them. Same with the foliage down below. It's great that we have the control that we do, though, because of the brush we've chosen. There we are. It's quite nice. You can even use this brush to cut along the top of this one more time. Add an additional layer, make it a little bit more thick and prominent. Here I'm just cleaning off my brush, as we do. Now I'm going to let that dry, and then we're going to come back in and work on these top areas, which will be a little bit more gray. Now I'm going to take this medium-sized square-headed brush, grab a little bit of Mars Black, mix that in to the pigment we were just using, create a slightly darker variant of it. We're going to do this so we can create a little bit of depth in our painting. We don't want this to be entirely flat, we want it to be progressively getting either brighter or darker as it moves from one side to the other. And this side, it's much closer to us, our eyes can recognize it much better. So I'm going to make the back end of this a little bit darker. So, using this brush, I'm going to apply this slightly darker variant of the pigment and move it forward. Doesn't have to be perfect. This is more of a rocky-like area. It's going to have a little bit more of a granular effect texture-wise. That's not a bad thing. That's why we waited for it to dry, so that we wouldn't have a perfectly smooth gradient or application. We had something that was a little bit more changing and evolving. Grab a little bit more of that Mars Black. Again, apply it in the back. Move it forward. You can even grab it and go all the way across, covering portions of your trees and your lamp posts if you want. This will ensure that the gradient progresses very smoothly. There we are. Throw a little bit over here. Clean off my brush. Continue to have it move forward. We can even make the edge over here slightly brighter. So I'm going to take a little bit of titanium white, mix that in with the other portion of our non-mixed area. Throw that on this side. And just work it backwards instead. Allowing it to dissipate and blend into the previously applied, now dry layer. Again, if it's a little bit chalky, it isn't a perfect blend, that is just fine. Because of the subject it is. Now we have a gradient getting brighter to darker and creating some depth in our painting. Now we're going to move up to this top area. Going to grab some of our Mars Black. Going to grab some of our titanium white. Mix up a nice darker gray to begin with. We can add highlights to it after. Going to begin by keeping the bottom portion very sharp. So I'm starting there, then I'll blend upwards a little bit. I have a lot of water, so I'm able to drag my paint fairly far, but it is going to be semi-transparent, so we will have to go back, do a couple of layers. Right now I'm just kind of asserting my line work and discerning where everything's going to be. Now we're going to put the top of the brush up here, move it across. That way we get a nice sharp top line as well. We go blend the middle area. Probably need to do a couple of layers, as you can see. Dip our brush back in the water. Some more of that Mars Black paint. We're going to desaturate it a little bit as we move backwards. Just be careful not to make it much brighter. There we had a really nice long clean stroke. Now this doesn't have to be perfect. It's a stone wall, water falls on it, it ages, it cracks. Different areas are built on different elevations. but you want it to be fairly clean. There we are. Now we're going to take this and very delicately add it to the back as well. There we are. From there, I'm going to grab my smaller square-headed brush so that we can work with a little bit of additional detail in here. I'm going to grab some of my titanium white, mix up a nice brighter version of this. We're going to apply it to the top area that's going to be receiving more light. Now, because of the angle I'm painting at, I'm having a really hard time getting a straight line. So if you find that you're not getting the angle you want, or that you're not able to get a very clean application, try moving around the canvas. I'm going to do that right now, and I'm going to start trying to paint from the other side of it. See if we can get something that's a little bit more clean. So now I'm over here, other side, and we're going to continue to work on this nice little detailed area. Here I'm adding that gray to the top portion of this that will be showing, cleaning up both the top and the bottom lines, and I'm finding that over here on this new angle, I have a lot more control of my brush. Sometimes that's all it takes. Sending it back, and then eventually getting to a point where we can't see it anymore and just allowing it to dissipate into the background. So now we have a top to it, we have a side to it, we're starting to build up some dimension there. And we might go back in and add some bricks, but I want to keep it fairly simple in the beginning. So we're just going to add in a little bit of a stone texture. I like to do that by taking my brush and just doing a little bit of a tapping with similar pigments to what we just applied. It's going to make it a little bit more rough looking. We can take lighter pigments and darker pigments. See, just like that. Give it texture, make it interesting. Little slits, areas that protrude and catch a little bit more light. Just makes it much more lively. Keeping it nice and clean along the edges still, even with that new tapping effect. Now, as we mentioned, might want to do a little brickwork, but first let's continue to layer as we should. So I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to come into the water. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to allocate a good portion on my palette, and then we're going to jump right back into the painting. So now we're going to enter into the water area. I'm going to do so with the larger square-headed brush because much like the sky, it's a very large area and it'd be nice to be able to cover it fairly simply. Now for the sky, we pre-mixed all of our colors on our palette, which is something I generally advise when you are just entering into a painting, when you are deciding upon your color palette. It's a very easy way of playing with your colors without committing to them on the canvas. So now that that's done, I kind of know what blues I want in this, what saturation levels I want. So I can enter into this by blending more so on the canvas. You could still do it on the palette, it wouldn't be a bad idea, but I feel fairly confident about just jumping into there. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit damp, as we do. I'm going to make the back of the water fairly bright. So I'm going to take a pure titanium white at this point and just work that in back here. We can still see a lot of our drawing through it. Then I'm going to take some primary blue, work that into the middle area, as you can see. Blend it back into that titanium white. Still using that square-headed brush's nice sharp edge. As you can see, cutting along the brick wall very efficiently. And we'll use horizontal strokes, blend back downwards. Covering up a lot of the rock here on the edge, but that's okay. I can still see through it. Then I'm going to grab a bit of Mars Black, throw that here in the foreground. It's farther away from the horizon and the light. We will be able to see highlights better because we are close to it, but we can add those in subsequent layers. So as you can see, just moving upwards with the black. Going to grab more of that primary blue. Start blending them together. We want more high contrast here in the foreground. So we are using more of that pure Mars Black at this point. There we go. And I'm blending it all the way back. Then I'll take those highlights that I just moved, bring them in front here as well. Now we have a lot of paint on the canvas right now. It's good. Means we won't have to do too much layering. Going to dip my brush. Take some more of that primary blue, add it more to the middle here. Trying to avoid brush strokes ending in the middle area, so I'm using very soft applications, though I'm allowing slight brush strokes to show through horizontally, just because it'll look like slight movements in the water. Now I'm going to take my medium-sized square-headed brush, grab a tiny bit of Mars Black, a little bit of that primary blue, a lot of titanium white, mix up something fairly bright like we have in the back, but with a little bit more gray in it. I'm just going to desaturate it a little bit. We're using this so that I can be a little bit more detail oriented, but we're just making it match the clouds a little bit more. Then, like we did before, we're moving it forward. We're going to leave the middle, or rather the edges of this, quite dark, and start to add some brightness into the middle portions, where the light from back here can reflect onto it much more easily. Mixing up a little bit more, jumping back in, adding it to the middle, blending it out horizontally. I apply less pressure as I get towards the edges, which allow it to be a soft transition from one into the next. There we go. Just going to keep doing this, adding layers slowly. Not doing anything too dramatic at this point. Starting in the middle, cleaning our brush off so it doesn't have too much paint on it. We don't build anything muddy. And then blending it out to the sides. Remember, allow the edges to be a little bit darker. You can let some brush strokes show through in the middle. We just don't want it to look like the brush strokes are ending in the middle of the water, which is why I'm going over into the brick and garden areas. It's very close to what I'd like. Now I just want to touch up the background a little bit, so I'll make a little bit of a darker pigment. Apply that around the edges. Clean off my brush so that I don't have much. I want it to be very subtle. And blend that in softly, subtly. Use a good amount of water if it's grainy and the background is fully dry. There we are. That is our first layer of water. Looks quite good. I think we'll just add a little bit more to a second layer in the back here. Make it a little bit more thick. We added a lot of pigment here in the foreground, so no canvas shows through. We'll just go back and do a little bit more here and ensure the same goes for the background. Just like that. Nice and easy. Now we're going to let that fully dry and jump into our next portion of the painting. So next what we're going to do is begin to work on the bricks down here. It's going to be a similar color palette to what we used up here so that we have a very cohesive feeling within all of it. I'm going to jump in with the larger square-headed brush just so we do get that nice detail work. And as per usual, I'm going to start by dipping my brush in the water. Now I'm going to create a darker layer first, and then we're going to make it brighter on top. So I'm starting with a Mars Black / Titanium White, as you can see. And then I'm just going to simply start sketching this in. Just making sure you can see. We can draw in the garden after this. No worries there. Covering all of it fairly confidently. Just creating that nice foundation and base. There we are. Remember, if it's not gliding smoothly on the canvas, just add more water. Should be quite well from there on out. Now I'm going to do the same thing over here. Hands probably in the way, but it's a very difficult angle to get. We're just kind of doing more of the same. There we are. Now, cleaning my brush off quite well, getting the paint off, that way we can retire it for the moment. Then, I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush, ensure that it is also quite damp. I'm going to take some titanium white and move that over into our initial application, build something a little bit brighter, and then we can start working in some detail. So I'm going to create a series of brick-like rocks. They're not going to be perfect bricks because I want something that's a little bit more interesting, a little more eclectic. But we're going to keep that general shape and pattern in there. So what I'm going to do is apply the highlight initially to the top, just like that. And allow the bottom area to be a little bit darker. If it goes down too far, that's okay. We can go back in and reintroduce those darker areas. And I'm also going to create the edges for these with this brush as well. Should dissipate and get smaller as we get farther into the background, just like the drawing we had. In fact, you can even redraw them out. It helps. Can also make the top all bright and then interject the spacing as well. So there are a number of ways of going about this sort of application. I'm just trying to show you as many as possible here. Creating this nice highlight, leaving that bottom area darker. Again, not making it perfect because it is stone. It's going to have inconsistencies, and we don't want it to be boring. Adding a little bit of a darker pigment back into this area, just because it was quite bright. Do a bit of a tapping effect. If you want more of a rocky tooth effect. There we are. I like that a lot. And we can't leave this as such a pure grayish black, so we'll get a little bit of highlight there and work that in as well. Not as much. but enough. There we are. So now we have some texture on the top, we have some separation on the bottom. Let's further extend that separation. Let's grab those nice darker pigments and rework in the separation. I find that stone and rock is generally best achieved through just a great amount of layers, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I'm going to take my pinky finger, I'm going to put it on the palette to get a little bit of a nice grip. Then I'm going to continue working my details back in here. It's all very subtle at this point, but it's meant to be. Take more of that titanium white, add that to the tops, separate portions of our stone. Remember, the top area is lighter because it has the sky more reflecting down on it, whereas the edging simply does not. Some areas will protrude though and catch a little bit of additional light. And much like this, it gets darker and dissipates as we get a little bit further back into the painting. Now, we did that over there. We'll probably go back in and touch it up with some highlights when we do the sky and this, but for now, that's quite good. I'm going to move over to this side and create the same thing. Except over here, we only see the tops, so we're only going to create the highlighted areas. Not using as much water because I do want it to be more gritty still. And remember to leave openings for different areas to be darker and lighter. We don't want it to be flat. These are protruding, they're much more natural. I'm going to grab a little bit of additional titanium white, mix that in, go back over here, do some additional tapping motions. You can even take that up here just to ensure that we get the same values in lots of our subjects. Coming along extremely nicely. A lot of the same techniques. So we have to ensure that we don't, again, come to that conclusion that, oh, this is easy, I don't have to try as hard. Make sure you're constantly giving it your all. Creating the best piece, the best brickwork, the best stones you can. You don't want to make them all look the same either. Diversity is still important. So there we have that. Going to let that dry. Then we're going to begin working on the brickwork or rather the stonework, up here as well. Now, one more little thing to mention before we go on to the bricks. We do need to work on this back area here as well. So, I'm going to take the smaller square-headed brush, get a lot of that pigment that we were using, get a bit of a darker mixture, and just draw that in. I'm using a good amount of water here so that I get a very nice clean line in the background, but that does mean that it's going to be very transparent, and I might have to go back over it a couple of times. It's okay. I also don't want it to be a pure, stark Mars black, because it is in the distance, and I want to save those stark pigments for the foreground. So I'm making it dark, but I'm not making it exceedingly dark. There we go. Now we can move on to the stone wall here. So for this, I want it to be interesting, but I don't want it to take away from anything else that we've done. So I'm going to stick with a very similar color palette to what we have here. Maybe make the rocks a little bit more gray, with red, with brown, similar to that, brighter. So I still have that mixture on my palette, as you can see, and it's also apparently still on my palette knife. So I'm just going to grab some of our primary red, going to grab some of our burnt umber, and mix those two on our initial area. Then I'm going to grab some titanium white paint, a little bit of Mars black, and see what we end up with here. Should be quite similar to what we are working on top of because we're using similar colors. This one is simply a little bit more red. We'll make it a little bit brighter. Take some titanium white, and give that a try. I'm going to use the square-headed brush, the smaller one, because I do want to carry a good amount of paint. I'm going to start over here, kind of play with a couple different angles, see what's comfortable, and then make my first application. So that could be a brick. I'm going to take some additional titanium white, splatter that in. Looks quite a bit better with the texture. Let's try a little bit more. We're just testing it, seeing what we like here. If we don't like it, we can take it off. Take a little bit of Mars black, desaturate it a bit. Then I'm going to shut off my camera and take about 10 steps back and take a look at it. See if it's what I want it to be, if it'll look nicely with everything else. Then we'll come back and we'll make our decision whether we continue or we change it up a little bit. So after taking a couple steps back, talking about it, I realized that the bricks were a little bit too pink, and I think I want to go with something that's going to match the top and the bottom. Again, making it cohesive. But I have all of this pigment on my painting. I have two options here. I can cover it with a new brick, or I could take a very wet brush, try to work it off, as you can see there. Then take my finger and just wipe. It's a little bit left on there. It's a little bit more pink, but that's okay. It's in the foreground. Still looks quite good. It's an easy trick if your pigment is still very wet and the background is fully dry. But with that in mind, we're now going to take our palette knife. I'm going to clean this very well, mix up more of those grays that we had, and then jump back into the painting. Lots of little breaks through this process of kind of figuring out exactly what colors you want, but it's important that we take the time to do this right. So to achieve more of this, it's generally best to start with our darker base color like we did for this first one, and then add on the additional highlighted layers. Now I don't want to start with a pure Mars black, so I'm going to take some pure Mars black and mix it with some titanium white over here. Not much titanium white, but just enough to brighten the value slightly. That's why we're using our palette knife, and that's why we're doing it in the area that we are. We'll have a lot of this mixed pigment to work with, and we'll be able to really work on all of our bricks at once rather than having to go back and mix more pigment. So that is what I'm going to be using. I'm going to take that smaller square-headed brush yet again, dip it in a little bit of water, grab some pigment, and draw on nice brick. Now, I don't want my bricks to be perfect in this. I want them to be changing, be a little bit more creative. So I'm just sketching these on right now, leaving different openings. And an issue that I see with a lot of beginners' brickwork is you'll leave all of the openings in the same line. Try to make it so they're always changing, creating little ladders and pathways. It'll make it so much more captivating. Also, not all bricks have to be the same lengths. So, we'll make some smaller, some much larger. Make the process a whole lot more fun. Now, this is only the bottom layer. It's important to remember that. We're going to go back in, we're going to add in the highlights, we're going to add in the midtones. We're going to make it look much more interesting. We're just building the foundation right now. Consistently going back, grabbing more water, because it is important that these areas are nice and sharp. There we go. Also, much like this wall, they need to start getting smaller and smaller as we move towards the back of the painting. Here is a breaking of our initial rule. I'm having them split on the same area of each, and that's just because it's important to break the rules once in a while with these. It's a way of making sure it's changing. So, as we get smaller in the background, I'm using more of the corner of my brush instead. Just because that fine, full edge can be a little bit large. And we do need to consistently be making these smaller. We can also make them less noticeable as we move into the background here, and that just means adding more water and less additional layers. We can be a lot more loose with our application as well. Here, starting to get a little bit messy with it, and that's okay. I'm just making it a little bit more impressionistic as we get into the background. I'm not too worried about much over here. Then I'm going to take a little bit more of that, come back and just touch up some areas. Add some additional pigment to the ones that are a little bit thin. And ensure that they're nice and different. Connect a couple of them if we find things are a little bit too similar. And if there are open spaces, deal with those as well. There we go. Now we're going to start working on the detailed portion of these in the midtones and the highlights. For that, I'm going to move to the other side of the painting. As we learned, there's just a better angle for that sort of thing. And I'm going to do a lot of that with my smaller round-headed brush and the smaller square-headed brush. So we're going to jump right into that now. So here I'm going to take my smaller round-headed brush. Going to take some of that titanium white and move that over here, and now I have a bit of a highlight pigment to work on these with. I'm going to predominantly pick the tops of the bricks to apply this with first. Add a little bit of detail there, doing it fairly roughly, and then we'll go in with a bit more of a highlight. Now, I didn't use the palette knife to mix this color because we simply won't need too much of it, but when we move into the real highlights, we will definitely be using that yet again. So here, just continuing, allowing it to dissipate. It's getting lesser and lesser as we move this way. Got more of a highlight starting over here, letting it run out on my brush, and then moving it back into these ones, where it won't be as stark and it won't be as noticeable. Probably won't even need to bring it back into these because they will be so far away and they're already dissipating to a fairly good extent. There we are. Now we will grab the palette knife yet again, grab some titanium white, move that back into our initial mixture. Get a little bit more, get even brighter. And now we can continue. Going to start again on the tops and occasionally work my way downwards and inwards. Just creating some additional detail and highlight. I'm not going to do a lot of them back here, just because I don't want this area to pop as much. Predominantly keeping this in the foreground. And we're also keeping these strokes fairly rough. If they're a little bit gritty or toothy, that's not a bad thing, because it is stone and rock. And it actually is quite advantageous for the piece. Now I'm going to grab some pure titanium white for it. But it's worth noting that we're not going to get a pure titanium white on the canvas because the brush is fairly damp. It will be semi-transparent and it'll dry a little bit darker as acrylics do. So I'm starting by just applying this to the tops as we did before, and if we want we can work it inwards as well. There we go. Going to take some more of that titanium white, move it up here, just to ensure that the values are similar enough. And throw it on some of the sides, connect areas if we want. I'm not going to get too crazy with it. You can move back some darker pigments in there as well. So we have a well-balanced set of highlights, midtones, and darker values. We're just trying to ensure that none of the bricks look flat. That definitely did the trick. Now we have a much more interesting wall. The bricks aren't perfect, they're not meant to be because they're plastered into the wall in different ways. It's a little bit more organic looking, and we're going to have a lot of the garden covering it as well. It's just a subtle detail for the background. So with that being said, we are actually now going to let this dry and move on to the next portion of our painting. Now we really get to have some fun and start working on the foliage up here at the top. Now we're going to need a lot of it, so I'm not simply going to mix my palette with a brush. I'm going to use this guy right here. First, as per usual, I'm going to clean it off very well. Ensure that we have a clean palette knife so that we have undiluted pigment. Then I'm going to grab some of our primary red here, move it out into the light, move my palette back a little bit so you get to see a little bit better. I'm going to grab some of this blue, mix the two together. We're working on the back of the foliage first. That's going to be a little bit more purple. Grab a little bit of Mars Black, not much. We won't need much. And a tiny bit of titanium white, just to desaturate it minorly. Now we're going to switch over to our older square-headed brush, grab some of that pigment, find where our last tree was, and begin to apply some of this foliage. Using this nice tapping motion, as you can see here. And that is my cat. He's very chatty. He likes to talk a lot. And that's nice when you're a painter because you spend a lot of time inside painting. So if you get a nice chatty animal, you feel like you have your friends around. It's quite nice. Highly recommend it. But back to the painting here. I'm applying a lot of thick pigment to the center areas, and then with this tapping motion, as I run out of paint, I move towards the edges and allow it to dissipate. It's going to give us a more transparent look, and it's going to make it look like the clusters of leaves in the center are much more prominent. There are a lot more of them. And then as we get towards the outskirts, there are less and less, which is why it's more transparent. The eye can't focus on them, and you see more of a mix. So I'm just continuing this process, as you can see, into the foreground here. Can still work my way around the outsides of these trees. We're covering a lot of the branches, but we can still see through them, and a good amount of it, because we did draw the initial image in a Sharpie. There we are, trying to ensure that there are different clusters of foliage. It isn't just a single large patch at every interval. It's also important to remember that, again, this is simply our first layer. I'm going to build on so many highlights, and it's going to be even brighter and more saturated, more vibrant than that bottom area. It's not going to remain dark like this. But we do need more of this darker pigment to finish off our base layer. So, grabbing some red, grabbing some blue, mixing them together. We'll grab a little bit more red because we are in the foreground now. I'm going to take some titanium white, not much, some Mars Black, not much. Now we have a lot more paint to work with. Now if you want to save time, I know this is a much longer lesson, but it's a good thing to keep in mind. If you want to save time, you can take the larger square-headed brush, dip it in a little bit of water, grab your pigment, work around the edges of your branches that you want to save. Gets paint on a lot more quickly. A little bit of a dried piece right there. Take that off, nice and easy. We can apply it like this, as you can see, and then quickly switch to the old square-headed brush and work out the edges. Easy way to save some time, if you ever find you need to. There we are. Now I'm going to go back and apply some additional pigment to these areas because they didn't have any blue, and it's much more apparent that there's a canvas, a white canvas right behind. Remember that these acrylics are fairly transparent, and this is making it just so noticeable. Now we are covering a lot of this up with highlight, so it isn't a big deal, but it's better to be safe than sorry. There we are. Covering a very large surface area right now. Taking some time, but boy will it pay off. Still using a lot of that tapping effect once we apply the pigment. Still just grabbing that same pigment from my palette. Don't need to change it up yet. There we are. Great first application. Just working my way back around, covering up areas that look a little bit thin. Then we will clean our brush because it has had a lot of wet paint on it for quite some time. And we're just going to ensure that we get to keep using it. There we go. So now we have our base layer, but we need to start adding in some highlights. We need to get it brighter and more vibrant, more saturated than that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take my palette knife, going to clean it, as we do, and mix up a new version of our pink. So I'm going to take that primary red, I'm going to take just a hint of the blue, I'm going to take a fair amount of the titanium white, I'm going to mix these together. Here you can see we have a very heavy difference from one to the next. But when we apply this to that, as we know, it's not going to look just like that. It's going to be a mix. It's going to be a combination. That's important to realize. Now, I also want to make this area of foliage closer to this. So then as we get closer to the foreground, we make it brighter. So for that area, I'm going to mix another little section here. I'm going to take some of the darker pigment, some of the brighter pigment, and just try to get something that's fairly close to what we had back there. Remember, we test it by putting it up to our painting. Getting a little bit of that Mars black, more titanium white, primary red. Just work it back and forth until we find what we actually want. And that is very close. So this is going to be for the back here. This is going to transition into the foreground. So, cleaning my palette knife off, grabbing my old square-headed brush, and we're going to start applying some highlights. So here, starting in the background, going to leave openings and areas in the foliage. And there you can see it. It's extremely similar, blended quite nicely there. Then we're going to move it a little bit more into the foreground, around the backs of the tree. As you can see there. Remember to leave openings. Get to add lots of detail on a canvas this size. We also don't want too much detail or darker areas in the back. So once this is fairly dry, I'm just going to roughly work over a lot of it, just to brighten up those darker areas. Move a little bit of highlight on top of them, but the detail will be preserved before, or rather because, the paint has had time to dry to a good extent. So it's more of an advanced technique for sure, but you can achieve some really wonderful things with it if you time everything right. There we are. Now we're going to move more into the foreground, so I'm going to switch to the nice hot pink variant. So we're going to begin applying that up here. Oh, that'll be so nice. Starting at the top, areas that are closest to the sky. Then we'll work our way inwards. Just like that. Going back, grabbing more of that pigment, working it along the edges, and then back up. The middle of the clusters will generally be a bit darker because they'll have so much more foliage and the light won't be able to work through it as easily as it will the edges. So we're trying to ensure that the top is fairly bright and then the bottom portions are also a little bit brighter as well, just because that light will wrap around. There we are. Go back in, slowly build up our highlights even more. Notice that there's like a line here and then a darker area and then more of a highlight and then a darker area and then more of a highlight, just kind of wrapping around. It's an easy way of adding a lot of highlight but keeping the contrast in there so that we notice how bright the highlight is, because if it's all highlight, then it won't look bright or vibrant because it won't have anything in contrast. You need the darker areas and the desaturated areas to see the light, and that's why we use such a gray-blue sky and all of the gray down here as well. There we go. So we're going to continue here by grabbing some of that additional hot pink pigment and reapplying it to the areas that really need that highlight. I'm also going to start moving it back here. As you can see, I want it to dissipate as I move down this tree line, so I'm using a softer touch of my brush, and I'm only moving down here when I know I don't have a lot of pigment on my current brush. There we go. We can add a little bit back here, but it needs to be minor. We also don't want this to look like an outline around all of our trees, so make sure that you're blending it in from the top, as I'm doing here, creating that gradient down into that darker area. There we go. Now we're going to take our palette knife, grab a little bit more of that titanium white paint, mix that in to our previous application, get something a little bit brighter, and then begin to apply that. Now we get some real nice highlights. We're getting to the point where my brush has a little bit too much paint. As you can see, that splatter was quite large, so I'm going to ensure that it is nice and clean, first of all. Then I'm going to dry it extremely well. Then we're going to go back, grab that pigment, and begin to reapply it. As you can see, the applications are much more small now. It's actually what we want. So we're just building up the highlights along these edges here. Starting to build up some volume, making it look fairly three-dimensional here. Just takes time, takes layers. Don't forget to apply it around portions of the bottom. And lead it back into here. We can take some of that other pink, the less highlighted pink, and work that on the back of these as well if you feel you've taken over all of it and you need a little bit more for that nice transition. That way we have our midtones in there as well. Now, that isn't all of the cherry blossom trees we want here, but we are going to let that dry for a minute. We're going to come back to it and we're going to work on the other parts of our tree that are a little more prominent. That way we can layer some foliage on top of them. So I'm going to clean this brush and then we're going to jump back into this with some additional fun pieces here. Now we're going to take our palette knife, we're going to take some of our burnt umber. This should have dried by now, and if it hasn't, that's okay. We could use a little bit of pink in our trees just as reflected light. But I'm moving a lot of burnt umber in there. Going to grab some Mars Black, and we're going to start creating the base layers for all of our trees. So we're going to need a lot of this pigment. I'm going to grab some more burnt umber now that I know what I want, some more Mars Black. Mix that all about, just like that. Clean off our palette knife as we have. I'm going to use the smaller square-headed brush, and I generally advise cleaning your water, but again, the added pink in this is not a bad thing. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to go back to my farthest tree, and I'm going to begin working in the branches. Going to be very mindful of the movements, ensuring that these are always evolving and changing, building up into the top sections and out into some of the sides as well. We should allow the branches to get smaller as we move upwards and also get a little bit more transparent. We can leave areas open where they kind of disappear into the foliage. It'll look much more natural and real if you do that. So try to keep that in the back of your head as well. There we are. Nice clean little lines with this clean little small brush. Going to move that back down right there. Now, I'm going to grab some of our additional pigment, work on the next tree. As you can see, it might already be time to switch to the medium-sized brush, just because we are covering a lot of surface area here, and it could still do a really good job of creating a good base. That's actually what we're going to do. We're going to put this one down, we'll return to it, we get to the tops of the trees. But for now, we'll create the bases with this larger brush. And we're doing this right now because we do have a lot of pigment mixed on our palette, and I just want to make sure that we use a good portion of it before it starts to dry. So I'm just filling up the larger areas. Come back and do the detail work in just a little bit. Now these are looking extremely stark relative to the rest of the painting, and that is just fine. We can go back in and make them more subtle in the background. We probably will with that one, and maybe a little bit with that one as well. But we're getting a very unified look by using the same pigment for a lot of it. And we're ensuring we have a nice thick backing because we have all of these other pigments on the canvas right now. And this is just going to make sure that despite having all of them, we're going to have a very strong and sturdy looking tree that is fully opaque. Again, not doing the smaller branches or the detailed edgings right now. We're just taking care of the larger portions of our trees. This one, we might even be able to switch to the larger square-headed brush. It's always so cathartic to cover this much canvas so quickly. There we are. Still working cleanly around the edges. Might have to mix a little bit more paint. It's okay though. This, we only used Mars Black and a Burnt Umber. Not difficult to mix more of. Not a complicated pigment. There we go. Beginning to run out and it's getting a little bit choppy. I don't want to have to drag it and get a very chalky aesthetic. So we're going to take our palette knife, get a lot more Burnt Umber, have to put some more on our palette here. Mars Black. Create a fairly similar mixture. And just get right back to it. Don't rush around the edges. Make sure they're nice, clean lines. There we are. Now I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush and start doing more of that detail work again that we did in that back tree. Lots of little branches sprouting out in different directions. Some bigger ones too if we feel it's a little bit empty in varying areas. We can also give the tree offshoots, make it a little bit more interesting and dynamic. And at this point, this tree is probably going to look a little bit overdone in comparison to the other ones. But that makes sense, and you shouldn't worry about that because we haven't done the smaller branches for the other ones yet. Don't let something like that stop you from incorporating some nice detail, creating some beautiful trees. Now we're going to move on to the next one. We can always go back and add more, should we desire it. I can see a lot of the branches that I drew initially. It's quite nice, makes doing this fairly easy. But again, if you can't see them, you can either make them up, go back to the start of the video, or look at the sketch that was included. Making some of the branches larger occasionally, just to make it look a little bit more sturdy. Covering a lot of the canvas here, but with the same techniques. Leaving a little part of that behind the foliage, just going to make it a little bit more interesting. You can lose that behind the foliage again as well. Allow the branches to get a little bit smaller, a little bit sharper as we move up here. Not very vocal during this part, just because, Again, we're doing a lot more of the same. There we go. Can't forget about the trees on the other side as well. By working on this side right now, it's also giving us a break from the primary set of trees, which is good because it means you'll be able to look back at them in about a minute with a very fresh perspective. Switched over to the medium-sized square-headed brush just to get a little bit more done in a more timely manner. Go back over areas that are a little bit thin. Now we're going to take about 10 steps back from our painting and assess what we like about the branches, where we want to add smaller ones, and really what to do with it going forward.